Hey, everybody out there who are watching on YouTube and who've come in on the Zoom 2D experience. It's Rick Stone here. I want to welcome you here to our 3D virtual immersion experience. As far as I know, no one's ever tried doing this before. And we're going to have a lot of fun in the next few minutes as we take you on a journey, not just into the power of story, but also into the power of immersive reality. And I want to thank my friends from Utopian and Semiosis, and who've been able to basically orchestrate this incredible experience that we're going to be participating in. So Steve, who's our producer, I want to turn it back over to you, and I think we're ready to start the show. Hey, Steve?
Hey, Lisa, I'm here. Oh, hi, DP. Thank you all for inviting me to launch my book here at Utopian. You have to get used to these virtual worlds. One wrong turn, you can get lost in all these places back there. Hey, DP, what have you set up back there is great. If Chris didn't give me the wrong directions, I would have been here sooner. Oh, hi, Chris. I hope my virtual twin kept you all company. Hi, Rick.
Hey!
Say, Steve, it's a little cramped in here. Can you get me out of this box out there with you? That's what I like about virtual worlds. You can do what you shouldn't, wouldn't, and couldn't in the real world. Talking about the real world, I want to welcome everybody in both the virtual world here and the semi-real world of Zoom. We have moderators in the Zoom world too, so if you have a question, ask it in the chat, and if we don't get to it there, we will follow up with you. I'll be here in two forms. This is my real self, and my virtual twin down there in VR. So, is this where we're going to present?
Where do you want us to go, Rick?
That's a good question. Well, let's transport everybody across time and space. How about that wonderful theater in Pompeii? Make sure your time is set right. We want to get there before the volcano erupts. Welcome, everybody. Take a seat anywhere. This is an awesome stage. It's just like how I remembered it when I was young.
Rick, why don't you come down here to our level? Right here by your feet.
For sure. Let me get my material ready for the presentation. Welcome, everybody. I'm Rick Stone, the co-author of Story Intelligence with Scott Livengood. And today we're going to share with you how to master story, master life. The key lies in what I refer to as the 7 powers of story intelligence. Whoa. As we proceed, if you get lost, look for one or more of these monoliths. Each of them represent a power of story intelligence. If you remember anything, remember these 7 powers: to transport, communicate, enable learning, create meaning, transform, unite, and envision possibilities. These are what my friends refer to as their Rick Stones. Hey, Lisa, these would be good souvenirs for the Utopian store.
You bet.
By way of introduction, let me just tell you a little bit of background about me and Scott. I've been working with story for almost 30 plus years now and have been looking at the applications of story not only in organizations but in personal and professional development. And Scott and I, we met many years ago at the International Storytelling Center when we were board members and have been in a dialogue for years about how we could take the power of story to communities and to people like yourself. So that's enough about us. Let's talk about our new book, Story Intelligence, which we're launching today. We want to have a little fun with you, and as far as we know, this is the first time anyone has ever launched a book like this. So come along with me for a little journey into the power of story. You know, today, we're living through a perfect storm. There's a pandemic going on, a climate crisis that's just really around the corner. Our economies are in trouble. There's political polarization. More importantly, we believe we're confronting a crisis of meaning. The old stories, the meta-narratives that used to give structure and relevance to our lives, they aren't working anymore. In a recent poll of 4 in 10 of us have not discovered a satisfying life purpose. We need a new paradigm for what it means to be a human being in the 21st century. To create that, we need to reach back to our roots and reconnect to our story intelligence, or what we for short like to call SQ. It's an entirely new way of thinking about human capacity. So why story? Well, first of all, story is our native language. It's the vehicle we use for sharing our experiences of the past and for painting pictures of our aspirations for the future. It helps us to see ourselves as a significant part of an expanding universe. Most importantly, story helps us make sense of life's complexities, and it brings meaning and order to the puzzles that permeate our existence. Fundamentally, stories can create a feeling that we belong to a welcoming world where good inevitably triumphs over evil. You know, in days of old, we'd gather at night around a central fire like these on the stage to share our tales. Now, you know, many people would often tell stories gathered around these kinds of fires. And there's a wonderful African tradition where people would start out the night and be the full moon, and they would start with the stories of the everyday experience. And by the end of the night, they would make their way back in time to the beginning of time, to the creation of stories themselves and the creation of this world. And our ancestors, they created stories about the celestial bodies above us, and they endowed the stars with human dimensions. They incorporated the play of the firmaments into the collective story that we live in, allowing them to feel a little less minuscule and insignificant. Without story, there wouldn't be a Big Dipper or Orion, the Hunter, or Virgo. And without these stories, we would be less interconnected to our world and impoverished in comparison to the story-filled universe our ancestors created and inhabited. Story intelligence even imbued humans with the ability to create complex societies and cultures and to collaborate with thousands of other people. What's amazing is that simple stories were the key to managing all this complexity with ease and elegance. Our day-to-day world is born from our imaginations and sustained through the stories we create, tell, and believe to be inviolably true and factual. And our imaginations have conjured up religious philosophies and dogma, vehicles of commerce using currency and paper and zeros and ones traversing over the telecommunications lines. Political systems and nation states have inspired endless loyalty, and we're willing to die for it. Sports teams and we were willing to die and live for their triumphs and their defeats. And our plans and aspirations for a future are all tied in with story and those things that don't even yet exist. They're in a sense the stuff of fiction. You see, we humans are story-making creatures. We craft tales that become all too willingly our reality. To create some context for this is in relation to things you're no doubt familiar with. Story intelligence, or SQ, is a close relative or progenitor of emotional intelligence. You know, back in 1995, Daniel Goleman, he wrote Emotional Intelligence, and it's all tied to research that was being done on emotions. And he saw emotions at the heart of what it means to be an effective human being. In contrast, story intelligence puts the power of story at the heart of what it means to be effectual. It stretches beyond intellectual intelligence and emotional intelligence. In fact, our ability to function depends on our ability to master this innate feature of our personal, social, and spiritual existence. To live fully, Scott and I believe that we must embrace and understand the role story plays in our lives, and we must become experts at managing the stories we're bombarded with daily, and develop the know-how and the necessary ability to discern the ways they sometimes obfuscate the truth and limit our possibilities. But moreover, we need to learn how stories can also unleash our human potential. As we see it, we're on the precipice of a new breakthrough, and much of it comes from brain research. You know, Descartes proclaimed back in the 1600s, I think, therefore I am, and Carl Linnaeus came along about 100 years later and he named us Homo sapiens, wise humans. I think it's time for a new name for us, Homo Nerari, storytelling human. It's what distinguishes our species, and it's more defining than our reasoning ability or our emotional capacity. So I think we need a new watchword for today, and that is, I story, therefore I am. So today we're going to introduce you to the 7 powers of story and show you how to develop SQ, or story intelligence, to transform every facet of your experience. We believe story is the most powerful force in the universe, and it behooves us to understand this phenomena and learn how we can harness its power and minimize its deleterious effects. That's why Scott and I wrote Story Intelligence, to develop a map for all of us to recreate this powerful force in our lives, to re-enchant ourselves and restore and restory ourselves. And so we're going to show you how to consciously build story into our everyday living. So if you're ready, let's jump into the 7 powers of story. The first power is the power to transport. So Steve, can you transport us to a nice, peaceful surroundings to reflect upon this power of intelligence, the story intelligence? Yeah, I think that one over there, that looks great. Whoa, now that is the power to transport. That's a good power to start with. You know, the power of story to transport is all about the ability of story to take us to different places and times and empathically engage us in an alternate emotional reality. We've been telling stories for a long time. You know, the cave drawings, you can find them everywhere in the world, and in some ways those were the first PowerPoints when they captured their experiences, either killing a woolly mammoth or taking on another tribe, and that's the way they transferred knowledge and know-how to younger generations. And the beauty of it was that when people listened to these stories, they didn't have to suffer the consequences or take the risk of real action. And you could just hear the story and learn. So oral storytelling no doubt predated that by hundreds of thousands of years. And there's a question about our evolution. Which came first, our brain's development or stories? We think it was a stair-step development, and our brains developed and impacted the way we tell stories, and stories in turn impacted our brain's evolution. You know, in earlier times, when the Silk Road was there, it was the first viral network, and it wasn't as effective as the internet, but people carried their wares and their stories with them, and the stories spread like wildfire. In some fundamental ways, not much has changed. Most of the organizations I've worked with still rely on oral storytelling to transfer knowledge. So what do we mean by transport? If I say, once upon a time the cow jumped over the moon, you would give me your metaphorical hand and come along with me, and you would willingly suspend disbelief. You wouldn't say, cows can't jump over moons, they can't jump over walls, much less, but story's magic is that it can take us to another time and place and allow us to walk in another's shoes. And it all depends on our brain's wiring. See, our brains are wired for this. So there's an old saying that the body doesn't know the difference between a real event and an imagined one. And when we hear a story, we reimagine it. And something unique occurs. Gregory Burns dubbed this shadow activity, and he likened it to muscle memory that we develop from performing a motor task like maybe shooting a basketball. Just hearing a story about running, for instance, can activate the neurons associated with the physical act of running. And even though we're sitting in the movie theater or reading a novel or hearing a storyteller weave his tales, as far as our body is concerned, we're in the story experiencing it as though it were real. Most importantly, listening to others' stories transports us into their world, and it teaches us we're not so dissimilar. This invaluable transportation characteristic of stories allows us to achieve what Jules Verne predicted, time travel. Those with highly attuned story intelligence will be better equipped to imagine and anticipate alternate realities and futures and be better prepared to manage all those futures and what they hold and all the kinds of things that come about.
Can we ask a question, Rick?
Absolutely. Maybe my virtual twin can stick around with you a while as I set up over there to share with you all the next 2 powers. These stones take some time to set up.
That sounds great. So Rick, we're actually getting a question from the 2D audience. Why don't we walk this way and I could share what the question is. There's a question from Susan B. How can story intelligence help develop young minds?
Well, the most important thing we need to understand, and there's a great lesson actually from what happens to minds that are impoverished. Our brain, we need to hear stories as children. And that actually wires our brain to begin to develop what we would call narrative schema. We begin to see the world as a story. And when we can do that, we can see that our actions have consequences, and then we can make wiser choices. So children absolutely need to be hearing rich language and hearing stories all the time. And I think I see a light over here. I think we're getting ready to start again. So if there are more questions, we'll pick them up at the end. Hey, Lisa?
That sounds great, Rick. Thanks.
Okay, great.
Here I
Hey,
am.
Rick.
Let's get started. So the second power of story is the power of story to communicate. And this is about the ability to powerfully present a message to build a bridge to your audience and catalyze change. You know, stories can spread ideas and mindsets quickly across a population, much the way a flower spreads its pollen and seeds in the wind. Some important concepts to understand when looking at the power of story to communicate is this. The first is that the neurons that fire together wire together. Stories about ourselves, about others, and about our world get literally wired into our brains. That's why people are often resistant to reasonable arguments and irrefutable data. They're not equipped to change the wiring. They're stuck in the old story. The good news is the right kind of story can disrupt faulty neural wiring and even be an antidote. Just listening to a story can change our brain's functioning. Uri Hassen's research shows that what happens when listening to a story affects both the listener and the teller. They've put people in fMRI machines, and they can have two people sitting there, and they're having different kind of neural activity going on, but as soon as they begin to hear a story, they entrain. And not only do the listeners' minds entrain, the listeners and the teller's mind entrain. And we believe this demonstrates the neural roots of empathy. It's what equips us to emotionally identify with the protagonist of a story, especially if it's a story about someone very different from us, with different values and ways of seeing the world. That's why stories can be the key to changing someone's mind and helping them to see an issue or problem from an entirely different point of view. Here's a powerful example. You know, the women's suffrage movement here in the United States started in the early 1900s. You know, the men, who were the ones in power, believed that women were weak and unintelligent and incapable of the rigors of self-governance. But the women organized themselves into massive marches, something men had never actually done, and that got their attention. Maybe women who were very good at cooking could also do other things. The other thing they did is they adopted the description of Joan of Arc. She was the heroine of the 100 Years' War back in France who supported Charles VII to drive the English from French soil. She was strong and beautiful and courageous and fierce as she led men into battle. Now, the story of Joan of Arc allowed men to begin to see that, oh, maybe their mothers, wives, and daughters could be soft and virtuous people as well, but also strong and powerful and intelligent. And what happened is that story changed and won over men, and the women got the vote. So Lisa, let's see if there are any questions about the power of story to communicate. My other Rick here will be happy to field any of your questions.
Absolutely. Thanks, Rick.
Yeah. Hey,
Virtual
Lisa.
Rick.
Hey.
Let's see if anyone in our 3D audience has a question for you.
Yeah. Hey, Rick. There are people who are stuck in their individual careers. There are organizations that are stuck in the old ways. Story as a tool to communicate, to change through communications can be extremely powerful, isn't it?
Yeah, I think that, there's a predominant story that the old story was, you would get a job someplace and you'd stay there forever and that would be your career. And obviously that story is no longer relevant. But we often have expectations that get built in and we get locked into certain stories about the way things should be. And so when we become really adept in actually manipulating and working the story, we become more intelligent at being able to adapt new stories and say, okay, this story is no longer working. What story do I need to create in this moment that could actually propel me further in my career? So I think that it looks like we're getting ready to start the next one. So we'll pick up some more questions after this one.
Looks like we don't have to walk that far, Rick.
Yeah, we're going to stay right here.
There you are.
The third power of story is the power of story to enable learning. And this is all about the ability to thoughtfully enrich others' capacity to learn by integrating story into every subject matter. You know, Socrates once said that education is the kindling of a flame, not the filling of a vessel. And native peoples have been using story to enable learning for years now, and it's a foregone conclusion for them. And in the Oneida tradition, they don't even have a word for teach. The closest thing they have is enabler of learning. Thinking about how we educate young people, there are two divergent approaches to thinking that we often use in education. One is propositional thinking. It's useful, especially in the sciences and certain subject matters where analysis is important. But narrative thinking is all about context and relationships and meaning, and that's the stuff of our lives, and it's been lost in education. So let's take a moment to look at the role of story in human development. In the simplicity of telling and reading stories, something profound happens in a child's brain. It makes connections where there were none. Neural circuitry starts to wire itself, and remember, neurons that fire together wire together. And the child sees that they're just like the story's protagonists, and they learn that their actions have consequences, just like that character. And just as in the stories, characters benefit from wise decisions and suffer because of poor ones, children also learn to value postponing gratification and become better able to see that there are more substantial rewards awaiting just around the metaphorical corner. Storytelling then becomes a vehicle to help children develop impulse control. Now, what the Oneida people did was that they married story with reflection, and at the conclusion of every story, they would ask a very simple question: what might we learn from this? Now, they understood that a good question can invite the learner to deduce new perspectives and new ways of seeing themselves and their world that can be transformative. In the story Who Speaks for Wolf, which Paula Underwood shared with the world before she passed away, she tells the story of her people who were living in a place and they moved to another place in which there were a great community of wolves. And the story was used for teaching people to become better deciders, better decision makers. And they would always ask at the end of the story, what might we learn from this story? And they would start very young with children, and they would move up and tell the story over and over again, and until maybe as an adult, they would have gleaned everything they could from the story. Now, we've been taking this technology, this approach to story, and we've been applying it to a product we call Story Care, in which we've been looking at patient safety. And in this case, a lot of people are harmed in hospitals today, and the numbers are sometimes frightening. Up to 400,000 people a year die from preventable harm. Could we use story and the lessons of the Oneida to actually change that story? And so this has a library of stories that happen in hospitals, and at the end, teams debrief them, and they ask, what might we learn from that? Now imagine with me if we could use this power of story to engage all kinds of teams across multiple industries to improve not only safety, but teamwork and even innovation. So Lisa, let's pause here to see if there are any questions about the power of story to enable learning. And I'll let the virtual Rick field questions from the audience while I set up on that outcropping of rocks behind you.
I think that's a great idea, Rick. So let's
Great.
any questions from our 3D audience, feel free. Actually, you are unmuted. Does anybody have a question based on what they just heard from Rick? Go ahead, Dean.
Lisa, one of the things that just strikes me is the importance of children's theater, and Rick's absolutely hit the nail on hearing a story, hearing it said by actors with emotion and all, it adds a new dimension to it. And so I'm so excited to hear that said and how important it is to the learning process. As I often say, theater helps children understand how they fit into the world.
Yeah, and Gene, puppetry is another form of that. Actually, that in many cultures, it's very still a art form that is used really prominently for engaging children. and learning. So I think we need to move over. I see the next one is getting ready to set up, and so we'll have time for more questions. So let's go over here, Lisa. Follow me.
Sure.
The fourth power of story is the power to create meaning. And this is all about the ability to use stories to make sense of our life experience and live more purposefully. Imagine the first human who was curious and looked into a small pond on a moonlit night some 250,000 years ago and saw the reflection next to the image of that white orb. It awakened something in her, a question emerged in her head, and it was, what does it all mean? And in this first moment of self-reflection, humans have been preoccupied with their significance in a mysterious universe. And we created complex meta-narratives to explain and give meaning to our lives. But in many cases, these meta-narratives are gone. They're no longer relevant. So we must begin constructing stories from our personal experiences to make meaning of life. You see, we've gone through a process of what I call destorification, and it's kind of like deforestation. You know, if you cut all the trees down in a forest and plant nice, neat rows of pine trees, the life never quite comes back in a robust way. And that's what has essentially happened with us. We've lost connection because we've stopped gathering around fires, real or metaphorical ones, to tell and listen to and be enchanted by stories. So how do we restory ourselves? Let me tell you for a moment about the work of Robin Fivush and Marshall Duke, who are at Emory here in Atlanta. They've been working with family stories, what they call intergenerational narratives, for some time. And they found that children who hear their family stories and know them, they have a higher sense of resilience and self-esteem by knowing those stories. And in fact, it's the best predictor of those children having high resilience and self-esteem. And they call this autobiographical reasoning, and it's our ability to link our life events together. And they've even developed a do you know questionnaire, and it's available on our Story Intelligence website that you can download it. And this is what endows life with meaning, to biographically weave our life into a salient events and all of it to lead it into a kind of a global coherence. It's something we all need. So Lisa, let's see if there are any questions about the power to create meaning. And I know my virtual Rick, once again, he'll be happy to field them while we get set up for the next power of story.
Thanks so much, Rick. We actually have a question coming in from our 2D audience, and Mugarte.
Okay, great.
Give me one moment. It looks like the question was if story care has been integrated in with special needs children to help them with their education.
Well, actually, that product, I actually worked with my former company, Ideas, and Sinensis, which is a healthcare consulting group. And when I was working with them, we developed that product. And that was actually for healthcare teams. So it was what we would call low fidelity simulation. But I think it could be adopted to all kinds of settings because it was very powerful and easy. We just created oral stories, and they were recorded. So the idea was for a team to listen to the story and then debrief it. So it was in the world of simulation, it was low fidelity. So I think we're getting ready to start on Transform. So we'll talk more about that at the end of the event when I join Zoom.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, Rick. Looks like we don't have to travel too far.
No, we'll stay right here.
Here you are.
The fifth power of story is the power to transform, and this is all about the ability to transform seemingly intractable problems into enlivening possibilities to create new life trajectories. You know, Alexander Graham Bell once said, when one door closes, another door opens, but we often miss the rest of the quote, and that is, but we often look so longingly and so regretfully upon the closed door that we don't see the one which is open for us. Perhaps the thing that we hate more than a painful story is not having a story at all. We define ourselves by these narratives, and without them we experience a vacuum in our life. And the problem is, we often ascribe a conclusion to events that occur in our lives. If we lose a job or something terrible happens, we add an interpretation at the end. And if someone acts in a certain way with us, we generalize that one behavior to a broad point of view about them. But the truth is, we never really know the ultimate outcome, and even for difficult or tragic events. How can we come into a different relationship with the past? We think you have to recontextualize events to see possibilities instead of closed doors that define us. Let me give you an example from my wife, Elizabeth. She's been talking for years since I've known her about her father. And she had a difficult relationship with him. He was a bit of an irascible kind of guy, and he was very willful. But in the last weeks and months, she's been exploring stories about him and hearing more stories from her brother. And suddenly her relationship with him has shifted, and she has a much better relationship with him now than she had 40 years ago when he died. So you see, we must train our minds to manage life experiences flexibly. The story's never done. So we don't need to become fixated on the door that closes to create a rigid, confining story. We need to learn to reorient our perspectives to the presenting possibilities, even amid intense difficulty, and see our life as an opportunity regardless of what comes our way. You see, you can transform whole institutions and societies with the right kind of stories as well. And the World Bank has done it, and I work on the board of PCI Media, and they've been actually working with communities all over the world to change their story. Stories are powerful, and they can lead to new behaviors and new attitudes. So Lisa, let's see if there are any questions about the power of story to transform. And once again, I'll let my virtual Rick field those questions from the audience while I set up on that hill right over there.
Thanks so much, Rick. I will do. Let's see if we have any questions in the 3D audience. Maybe Brian, I think I see you back there. Brian, do you have any questions for Rick?
Nope, be shy.
Oh, perfect. Yeah, come on up close. And you could, there you go.
Unmute yourself.
The one question that keeps coming to my mind has to do with how you would adapt story to like a business use. A lot of businesses have to kind of tell their story, which is a little bit different from telling a personal story. And what tips do you have for someone who needs to craft a story around their business?
It's really a good question, Brian. You know, every business has got a story, whether they recognize it or not, or acknowledge it. So there is a story already going. And the question for the business leaders of today is, do they want to become more intentional about that story? And so the question really becomes, what story? And you know, I know that you used to work in Disney, and you know, for years, even after Walt died, they used to tell, you know, what would Walt do? You know, and those stories persisted. But sometimes the stories of the past can also hamper us, and they can confine us. So we need to know when to put aside. Oh, we're getting ready to start the next one. So come on down. We'll talk more about that because it's a great question.
Thanks, Rick.
The sixth power of story is the power of story to unite, and this is all about the ability to listen to and tell compelling narratives that help people transcend divisive or misinformed beliefs. You know, we're living in a time of disconnection and conflict and political polarization. It threatens the notion of civil society, and Pat Spate once said, "A story is the shortest distance between people." And now, while story intelligence is not the panacea for solving all of these problems, story can have an influential role in mitigating them to bring people together. We must understand that in some fundamental ways, we're hardwired biologically to distrust people who are different from us. In olden times, we saw them as maybe hostile or rapacious or murderous or wanting our lands. And it's wired into our brains to expect people who are different from us to do that. And if they were dressed differently or sound differently, we would react. So how do we overcome this innate wiring? We need to learn stories about how people are just like us, and that's the power of story, to break through those kinds of rigid ways of seeing the other. So how do we create a new story? Well, you know, in my tradition, the Jews have welcomed the stranger, and there's actually almost 36 places in the Torah where it talks just about that we not only need to welcome the stranger, we need to love them. Stephen Carter, in his wonderful book, Civility, he talks about when he was a child, his family moved into Washington, D.C. He was African American, and he moved into an all-white neighborhood, and he was sitting on the porch one day and watching the people go by, and there was not an act of kindness from any of them, or they even looked away. And then a woman came walking down the road, and she said, "Hi, I'll be right back." And she lived across the street, went in, and a couple minutes later emerged with a plate of sandwiches, of cream cheese sandwiches, and came over and shared with them. And suddenly everything shifted for him. He thought, oh, this is a welcoming place. And her name was Sarah Kestenbaum, and she probably heard all those stories while she was growing up Jewish, that you need to welcome the stranger and embody a concept of hesed, or kindness. Now, in my life, I've also been working with story in a lot of ways, and the Foundation for Mideast Communication that I worked with years ago, they were trying to bring Jews and Arabs together to listen to each other's stories. And more recently, the Combatants for Peace has been doing the same thing, bringing Israelis and Palestinians together to hear their stories. My buddy Paul Costello in Washington, D.C., he's also been working with people from different groups. And for example, he's been bringing Protestants and Catholics together in Washington, students, young students who are in their early 20s. And those kids growing up in Belfast in Northern Ireland, they still tell the story of Bloody Sunday, which happened in 1921, in which the IRA attacked the British and Protestants. And by the end of the day, over 100 people had died, hundreds were injured, over 1,000 homes were destroyed. And those stories are still told in the pubs today as though they happened yesterday. And if those people are hanging out in those pubs, their brains are pickling in the juice of that story. So he says the focus has always been on, let's make sure this doesn't happen again, rather than let's do something that's never been done before. He says it's not about the precedent of the past, but rather the unprecedented possibility of the future. And he's doing this work now with Israelis and Palestinians and other groups, and it's working. So let's pause now for another moment here, Lisa, to see if there are any questions about the power of story to unite. And the virtual Rick, once again, he'll field those questions from the audience while we set up for the last power of story.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Rick. Oh, hi, virtual Rick.
Oh, this guy, he keeps on turning everything over to me. I don't know why.
You must be related somehow.
I guess so. Yeah, so let's see if we got any more questions. We probably got time for one quick one before we get to the last power of story.
Yeah,
Anybody got a great question?
I think I see Wangui. Wangui, do you have a question? You want to come on up close? There you go.
Yeah, I think not really a question, but it's just interesting around creating unity. So it's not that you're trying to erase the stories or erase the things that happened in the past. It's just saying that, yes, we identify that this happened and we want to now, come together. And I think that's a really interesting, especially in this time in the world, right?
Yeah, and I think what Paul Costello's experience has been that you can go down a rabbit hole completely always adjudicating what happened and who was wrong, and he didn't find that very useful. What he found useful was engaging these people to ask the question, what now? What would you like to create together? And that shifted everything for him and for them. So it was a very powerful process. Yeah. Thanks for that comment, one guy. Yeah. Are we getting, I think we're getting ready for the last power.
There you are.
The final power of story is the power to envision possibilities. And this is all about the ability to prospectively think and to enable us to imagine a desired future and the actions required to realize it. Lewis Carroll once said, it's a poor sort of memory that only works backwards. So retrospective thinking is really about the past, and the prospective thinking is about the future. And we often think that storytelling is about the past, but I think it has a lot more to do with the future. So imagination, I believe, is the link between what is real and what might become real, and it connects the past to the future. And if imagination is this link, then story is the most important and potent language of the imagination for translating our hopes and dreams into reality. To understand this, let's look at how we could improve the act of shooting basketballs. So let me tell you for a moment about a study that was done years ago. They took a lot of subjects and they sat them in a chair and they said, we want you just to imagine making 20 baskets, all net, successfully, and do that every day for a week. And they took another group and they had them shoot actual basketballs, 20 baskets, free throws, for a week. And they found those who imagined themselves shooting baskets did almost just as well in improving their abilities than those who were actually doing the shooting. So you see, telling stories about the future is like that kind of practice for us. And it creates what one researcher calls imagination inflation. So repeated imagining of a future story actually improves our decision making in the present. And seeing the future events in rich detail, it reduces our anxiety and increases well-being. And it also increases our chance of remembering our intentions and acting on them. So there is real value in fantasizing about the future. It improves performance. In one study, students were asked to imagine getting an A, and they had another group of students imagine what the process would be to get to an A, okay? And those students who did the imagining of getting in the process did much better than just those who saw the A. And what's interesting is that 6 months later, they showed fewer visits to the health clinic. So there's something very powerful about our health and envisioning the future. So we need to help people develop their story intelligence in a way that can become powerful visionaries of the world that they want to create. To conclude this power, let me tell you a story about the future and those stories and how they can humanize us. And I will tell you the story about Robert Desnos. Robert Desnos was a poet from France, and he was jailed by the Nazis during World War II and ended up in Auschwitz. And one day he and a bunch of other inmates in that prison were put in a lorry and a truck and driven out to the countryside to be shot. And there they were lined up, and the soldiers were preparing their guns, and these people were hardly alive. And Desnos did something just unexpected. He stepped out of line and he took the hand of the woman next to him and he said, "Can I tell your fortune?" And she nodded yes. And he proceeded to tell her that she was going to have a wonderful life and that she was going to have 3 children and they would be happy and she would have all kinds of adventures in her life. And he went on and on and on. And someone next to her in the line said, "Tell my fortune," and handed him his hand as well. And then another person and another person. And suddenly these people came alive with the possibility that they had a future. And the guards, they were observing this. And you know, shooting people who were half dead was not something that was hard for them to do, but to shoot people who had a future, they didn't have the heart to do it. And they put them back on the truck and took them back to camp. Now, Desnos, unfortunately, he died in Auschwitz, but many of those people survived because of that story. Because of that story. So the stories of the future are nurturing, and they can change and transform our lives. So Lisa, let's see if there are any questions about the power of story to envision possibilities, and the virtual Rick, once again, he'll field those questions while we set up. And I know right there's a wonderful place full of stars and constellations that I think would be a great place for our concluding time together.
Thanks, Rick.
I see that over in the distance, it looks like there's a cow on top of the moon and getting ready to jump over the moon. And I think that may be our sign. What we'll do is, once again, over there, we'll have some chance to talk. And here we go. Whoa.
You were right, Rick. There is a cow on the moon. That's a
There
big
is a cow on the moon.
You're not kidding.
Oh, here you are.
Here I am. Well, I brought you here for our last part of our presentation, and these prehistoric ruins surrounded by our monoliths honoring the 7 powers of story intelligence, they remind us that these powers have always been with us as we have mastered our story to master our lives. They were with our ancestors, and they will be with the next generations to come. And I hope you purchase the book and hand it down to your children. So let me conclude by telling you a short story. And it's about Isaac Luria, a mystic in the 16th century. And he tells the story that God, when he created the universe, he created vessels of light. And the light, though, was so powerful that it shattered those vessels, and they were fractured, and they spread out throughout the universe, leading to a fractured world. And what happened is our world was fractured, and all of us in some way, fashion or form, have also been fractured and wounded. So what we need to do in our world is to do 2 things. First, we need to heal the world, and then to heal our hearts. And in Hebrew, that is tikkun olam and tikkun halev, to heal the world and to heal the heart. And it's our task as humans to gather these scattered shards and reunite them to, in a sense, finish God's work. We must repair our broken and hardened hearts, that's tikkun halev, and stitch back together all that is damaged and fractured in our world, that's tikkun olam. Nothing in the universe is better suited to this task than the 7 powers of story and nurturing your story intelligence. By becoming a master of your story, you are collecting the shards of light that reflect your memories of the past, your experiences of the present, and your hopes for the future. By understanding the ethical and existential implications of every story you tell, you can heal all that is broken within you and in the world around you. Let the light illuminate all that you cherish about the past and shine it as a beacon to brighten your path forward as you work to address the many issues begging for repair in your community and the world at large. In this way, you can become a powerful vessel for humanity's light, bequeathing the vision to those around you and to the children of your children and their children who will become tomorrow's storytellers. And they will become part of a grand tradition of giving birth to new, hopeful, and wondrous tales to sustain this beautiful planet. And now we'll open it up for Q&A, and I have to run, but the virtual Rick is here to answer any questions. And I want to thank everybody who helped make today possible, and thank you, Lisa, and DP, and Steve, and especially Chris. And I'll see you on the other side in another world, and no doubt in a better place and time.
Thanks so much, Rick. We have the opportunity right now for some questions. So I'm going to pass it to you, Rick. And do you want to maybe ask the 3D audience first, and then I'm going to check in with the 2D world?
Yeah, so we'll take some questions here, and then we maybe return back to the Zoom room there in a couple of minutes and see what questions you've got. Yeah,
perhaps the storytelling. Are you finding that storytelling is we start with children and we kind of focused on that, but what has been the experience as people become adults? And I'm sorry, somewhat more cynical, but yet, is it been proven effective when dealing with the college level?
Well, actually, Scott and I, we've worked with adults. I've worked with adults through the years. I just was working with a major government organization recently, and they're charged with actually telling stories about impact they're having in communities. And I worked with them in terms of actually helping them become better storytellers. And one of the interesting things, one of the people who was in that group said, usually when I go to do my PowerPoints and my presentations to leadership, I come in with all kinds of data and all of that. She said, I decided this last time I would keep the slides to the side and all the data slides, and all I did was tell a story. And afterwards, people said, that was the best presentation I've ever seen. And it was very powerful. So I think these are skills that everybody needs to have to be effective. And it's probably, it's something we're all wired for it. It's our native language. And somehow we've developed an assumption in business, especially that the stories are for just children or kids. But in fact, people are telling stories all the time in business, and they're using it all the time. And so the idea is, how do we become more conscious of doing that, I think, Gene? Martin, did you have a question?
Well, so I find this very fascinating, and it fits right in with the conference we did last year in Orlando on education as storytelling. One thing I think about is there is sort of telling stories, and then the skill of listening to stories, and then, as you've been talking about, the ability to write or create your own stories. And so I think that interaction is similar to what we're doing here, where there's a little bit more interaction than listening to a lecture. That the ability to create your own story is going to be a feature of the future.
Yeah, and there's that you really, the 3 pieces you just mentioned, I think, are so crucial. We talk a lot about storytelling, but story listening is really crucial. And we don't have a good track record of listening to each other's stories. And if we think about the divisions that we're living through right now, none of us have a tolerance to hear the other story, because we're so ensconced in our point of view that we think we have the right perspective. So story listening is crucial. And then the other piece, Scott and I have both worked with Sam Keen, who has written a lot of lovely books on the power of story. And Sam says, the word author has its root in authority. The word authority and author share the same root. So when we learn to become the author of our story, we develop authority about our own lives. We can take control of our lives in a sense. And so the question often is who's authoring our story if it's not us? And that becomes a crucial a piece of self-awareness, is to go, oh, I'm living out somebody else's story. It's not my story. It's maybe a marketing story, or maybe it was my parents' story, or it was a story that someone else, my peers told me. So when we become more conscious about authoring it, that becomes a big, I think, shift for people in the transformation moment. Thanks for the question. How are we doing, Lisa?
So Rick, there is one question from the Zoom audience that we're going to take, and then we're actually going to hop back in Zoom for some more questions.
Okay.
Zach, can I ask for a question from the 2D world?
It's funny, we're referring to them as the 2D world. I'm not sure.
And the bridge between 2D and 3D is now seamless.
Yeah, that's right.
What can we do with this technology? Think about this.
What can we do so our brains are pickling in a good story? I believe I got that right.
Yeah, okay, that's good. So that's a metaphor I use. I heard it years ago. It's but the question is what is our brain pickling in, and so we're not aware often that our brain is pickling in a destructive story, a story that brings us down. So we have to become conscious gatekeepers for the stories we're spending time with. And it's very easy with social media to get sucked down all kinds of rabbit holes of stories that are not nurturing for our souls. So the thing we have to do is really become much more conscious about ourselves as consumers of stories. And if we are consuming them, where do they come from, and how do we know they're true, and who's authoring that story, and what is their motivation for telling that story? And when we do that, I think that we're in a much better position to become the author of our stories and decide what do we want to accept into our little cocoon we live inside of, and what do we want to say, that's not my story that I want to live in and that I'd like to be pickling in every morning.
I think those are great insights, Rick. We actually have a very unique opportunity. We're all going to hop back in the 2D Zoom, and they're going to get to see the human Rick and the human Scott. So what I invite everyone right now to end the session, and we're going to go in Zoom. So thank you so much.
Okay.
We'll see you in Zoom.
I don't know if I'm coming in as 3D or 2D. We'll see what happens.
We'll have to see.
Thank you all for being here.